In the spring of 1972, in a hospital room in Champaign, Illinois, a dying farmer named Walter Hoffman called his two sons to his bedside and divided his life's work between them. 160 acres of prime Illinois farmland, black soil so rich you could grow corn in your sleep, land that had been in the Hoffman family since 1919 when Walter's father had bought it with 20 years of savings from railroad work. Walter was 64 years old, pancreatic cancer. The doctor said maybe a month, maybe less. His wife had died 3 years earlier. Now there was nothing left but the land, the equipment, and two sons who had never agreed on anything in their lives. Dean was 30, the firstborn, tall, confident, always certain he was the smartest man in any room. He had ideas about farming, big ideas, expansion, modernization, the future. Carl was 26, the younger son, quieter, smaller, always in his brother's shadow. He didn't have ideas so much as instincts, and his instincts told him to listen more than he talked. Walter looked at his sons standing on either side of his hospital bed and knew exactly what was going to happen after he died. They would fight, they always fought, and this time the fight would be about everything he had spent his life building. So he made a decision. "I'm splitting the farm," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. 80 acres each. Dean, you get the north half, Carl, you get the south." Dean nodded, already calculating. "That's fair, we can work it together, share equipment." "No," Walter's voice was firm despite its weakness. "You work your land, he works his. Separate. What you do with your 80 acres is your business, what he does with his is his." "Dad, that doesn't make sense, it's more efficient." "I know what's efficient, boy, I've been farming since before you were born." Walter closed his eyes for a moment, gathering what strength remained. "You two can't work together, never could, so don't try, just farm your land, make your own choices, live with the consequences." Carl hadn't spoken. He was watching his father's face, seeing something there that Dean was too busy planning to notice. "Carl," Walter turned to his younger son, "stay a minute after your brother leaves, there's something I need to tell you." Dean's face darkened. "Why, what do you need to tell him that I can't hear?" "Because it's not for you, go on now, I need to rest." Dean stood there a moment, jaw tight, then turned and walked out. He had always hated being second in anything, even in a private conversation with his dying father. When they were alone, Walter reached out and took Carl's hand. "Listen to me," he said. "Listen carefully because I'm only going to say this once." And then Walter Hoffman told his younger son a story. "Let me tell you about that story, because it explains everything that happened over the next 13 years. In 1933, Walter Hoffman was 25 years old. The Depression had hollowed out the Midwest like a slow disease. Corn that sold for $1 a bushel in 1929 was selling for 10 cents. Farmers who had borrowed to expand during the good years were losing everything. Walter's father, Heinrich, had been one of them. Heinrich had bought extra land in 1927, convinced that prices would keep rising. He took out a loan from the First National Bank in Champaign using the original farm as collateral. When the crash came, he couldn't make the payments. The bank moved toward foreclosure in the spring of 1933. But here is what Walter never told anyone, not even his wife. Heinrich didn't lose the farm to bad luck alone, he lost it to his own brother. Heinrich's brother August had married well, a banker's daughter from Springfield. When the bank was preparing to foreclose, August had the information before anyone else. He could have warned Heinrich, could have given him time to find another solution. Instead, August arranged to buy the farm at auction himself using his wife's family money. Heinrich Hoffman watched his own brother buy his land out from under him for 40 cents on the dollar. The family never spoke again. Heinrich died 2 years later. Heartbreak, the doctor said, though Walter knew it was really shame he had lost his land to his own blood. Walter spent the next 15 years working as a tenant farmer, saving every penny until he finally scraped together enough to buy the land back in 1948. He paid full price to August's widow. August himself had died in 1945, and Walter swore he would never under any circumstances take on debt again. "I never borrowed $1 after that," Walter told Carl, his voice fatting. "Never, not when the neighbors were buying new equipment, not when the prices were good and everyone said expand, never." "Why didn't you tell Dean?" Carl asked. "Because Dean wouldn't understand. Dean thinks he's smarter than everyone who came before him. He thinks the old ways are stupid and the new ways are better." Walter's grip tightened on Carl's hand. Dean is going to borrow money, Carl. He's going to expand. He's going to do everything I didn't do because he thinks I was a fool. What do you want me to do? I want you to keep the farmall. Carl blinked. The farmall. His father's 1952 Super M was the only tractor on the farm, 20 years old, simple, reliable, worth maybe $1,000 at auction. Your brother is going to want to sell it, split the money, buy new equipment. Don't let him. That tractor is yours, it's paid for, it works, and as long as you have it you don't need to borrow money for a new one. Dad, a 20-year-old tractor will do everything you need it to do. It's done everything I needed for 20 years. Walter's eyes burned with the last of his strength. Listen to me, son, the men who survive aren't the ones with the newest equipment. They're the ones with no debt. When hard times come, and they always come, the banks take the land from the men who owe them money. The men who owe nothing survive. Carl looked at his father, this man who had worked the same land for 40 years, who had never expanded beyond what he could pay for in cash, who had watched his neighbors buy bigger tractors and fancier equipment and had never once tried to keep up. I understand, Carl said. Promise me you won't borrow money, no matter what Dean does, no matter how much he laughs at you, promise me. I promise. Walter Hoffman smiled, the last real smile his son would ever see on his face. Good boy, he whispered, you were always the smart one, you just never knew it. He died 11 days later, and the war between his sons began. Let me tell you about the funeral, because that is when the mockery started. After the service, after the casseroles and the condolences and the awkward silence of neighbors who didn't know what to say, Dean and Carl stood in the kitchen of the farmhouse and began to divide their inheritance. The land was straightforward, the lawyer had already drawn up the split, the equipment was harder. The farmall, Dean said, that's worth maybe $500 at auction. We split that, buy something new. I've been looking at the John Deere 4020, twice the horsepower, power steering, we could share it. I'm keeping the farmall. Dean stared at his brother. What? I'm keeping it, it's not for sale. Carl, that tractor is 20 years old, it's a museum piece. The 4020 can do twice the work in half the time. I'm keeping the farmall, you can have the rest of the equipment. The plow, the disc, the planter, I'll buy replacements as I need them. That's insane, we're supposed to split everything 50-50. Fine, figure out what the farmall's worth, subtract it from my share of the equipment and give me the difference in cash, or don't, I don't care, I'm keeping Dad's tractor. Dean's face had gone red, he had always been quick to anger when he didn't get his way. Did Dad put you up to this, that private conversation you had? Carl said nothing. He did, he told you to keep the damn tractor, didn't he? Dean laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. Of course he did. Dad never understood that farming has changed. You can't compete with a 20-year-old tractor, you can't grow a business without investment. Maybe I don't want to grow a business, maybe I just want a farm. Same thing. No, Dean, it's not. Dean shook his head in disgust. Fine, keep your museum piece. I'm going to build something Dad never had the guts to build. And in 10 years, when I'm farming 1,000 acres and you're still puttering around on 80 with your antique tractor, don't come crying to me. He slammed the door on the way out. Carl stood alone in the kitchen, looking out the window at the fields his father had worked for 40 years. The farmall sat in the barn, patient and red, waiting for its new owner. I promised, Dad, Carl said quietly, I promised. Let me tell you about 1973, because that is when Dean made his first big move. 3 months after Walter's funeral, Dean drove to the John Deere dealership in Champaign and put a down payment on a brand new 4020. The price was $7,500, more money than Walter Hoffman had spent on equipment in the last decade of his life. Dean paid $2,000 down and financed the rest at $180 a month. Manageable, and corn prices were strong. The Soviet Union had just made massive grain purchases. Export demand was booming. Dean saw opportunity everywhere he looked. He borrowed more. By the end of 1973, he had rented an additional 40 acres from a neighbor. By 1974, he had bought another 80 on credit, using his original land as collateral. By 1975, he was farming 200 acres and already planning his next expansion. Every time he drove past Carl's farm, every time he saw that faded red farmall working the fields the same way it had worked them for 20 years, Dean felt a mixture of pity and contempt. Poor Carl, still doing things the old way, still afraid to take risks, still living in their father's shadow. One Sunday afternoon in the summer of 1975, Dean stopped by. He told himself it was a brotherly visit. Really, he wanted Carl to see how well things were going. "Still running the old girl, I see," Dean said, nodding at the farmall. "Still runs fine. I could get you a good deal on a 40/20, friend of mine at the dealership, you'd double your productivity. I'm producing plenty." "Plenty isn't the same as profit, Carl." Dean leaned against his truck, a new Ford also financed. "I cleared $12,000 last year. $12,000, what did you clear?" Carl was quiet for a moment. "Enough." "Enough," Dean laughed. "That's your problem, little brother. You're satisfied with enough. Me, I want more. I want to build something Dad never had the vision to build. Dad built plenty." Dad was scared of debt, scared of risk, scared of everything. You know what he told me once? He said he'd rather farm 80 acres free and clear than 1,000 acres in debt. Dean shook his head. Can you imagine? 1,000 acres and he'd rather have 80. Carl looked at his brother, really looked at him. Dean was wearing new clothes, driving a new truck, talking about numbers and expansion and growth. He looked successful. He sounded successful. But there was something in his eyes, a hunger that never got fed, a restlessness that never settled. "Dad knew what he was doing," Carl said quietly. "Dad was a coward, and if you want to be like him, that's your choice. But don't come crying to me when you're still farming 80 acres with an antique tractor while I'm running the biggest operation in the county." Dean climbed into his truck and drove away, gravel spraying behind him. Carl turned back to the farmall and ran his hand along the hood, feeling the sun-warmed metal, the chips and scratches of 20 years of honest work. "He doesn't understand, Dad," Carl said, "but I do. I promised I'll keep the promise." Let me pause here, because what came next took years, and watching it happen was one of the hardest things Carl Hoffman ever did. He watched his brother expand, watched Dean buy more land, more equipment, take on more debt, watched new tractors arrive, new trucks, a new combine, a grain storage building, irrigation equipment, hired workers. And he watched the debt grow behind it all like a shadow getting longer. Carl kept his own numbers quiet. 80 acres, the same 80 acres his father had left him. One tractor, the same farmall, now 30 years old, still running strong. No employees, no debt, no payments. He didn't make as much as Dean, not even close, but everything he made was his. In the spring of 1980, Carl made his last payment on the farmhouse mortgage, a small note his father had carried since rebuilding the kitchen in 1965. When that final payment cleared, Carl Hoffman owned everything on his farm outright. The land, the house, the equipment, every fence post, every grain of soil. He was 34 years old and owed nothing to anyone. That same spring, Dean refinanced his operation. Interest rates were climbing fast. The prime rate hit 20% that year, and Dean's monthly payments had become crushing. He took out new loans to pay old ones, stretching the debt over more years at higher rates. He told himself it was temporary, prices would come back, they always did. They didn't. Let me tell you about the crisis, because this is where everything turned. The farm crisis of the 1980s didn't arrive all at once. It crept in like a slow disease, one bad year at a time. 1980, interest rates spiked. Farmers who had borrowed at 8% were suddenly paying 15%. 1981, grain prices started falling. The export boom of the 70s was over. 1982, land values began to drop. Farmers who had used land as collateral found themselves underwater, owing more than their farms were worth. The foreclosures started, neighbors who had been farming for generations gone, equipment auctions every weekend, for sale signs on every county road. 1984, worse. 1985, worse still. Dean Hoffman held on longer than most. He was smart, hardworking, and had started from a strong position. But smart and hardworking don't matter when you owe more than you can pay. By the spring of 1985, Dean was 6 months behind on his loans. The bank had sent letters, then warnings, then a man in a suit who sat in Dean's kitchen and explained in calm professional language that the time for negotiation was over. Foreclosure proceedings would begin in 30 days. Dean sat in that kitchen, the kitchen of a farmhouse he'd bought in 1978, the centerpiece of his empire, and tried to understand how it had all gone wrong. He had done everything right, expanded when prices were high, invested in equipment that made him more efficient, worked harder than anyone he knew. 18-hour days during planting and harvest, 7 days a week for months at a time. None of it mattered. The prices were wrong, the interest rates were wrong, the debt was real, and the bank wanted its money. Dean picked up the phone and made the hardest call of his life. "Carl, it's Dean. I need to talk to you. Let me tell you about that conversation, because it changed everything between them." Carl drove to Dean's farmhouse that evening. It was a bigger house than Carl's, newer, nicer, bought with borrowed money during the good years. Now it felt hollow. Dean was sitting at the kitchen table with a bottle of whiskey in front of him and a glass in his hand. He wasn't drunk, just tired, beaten. "I'm losing it," Dean said without preamble. "All of it, the land, the equipment, the house, the bank's foreclosing." Carl sat down across from him. "How bad?" "$700,000, that's what I owe. The land's worth maybe half that now, the equipment's worth less." Dean laughed, a short, broken sound. "Remember when I told you I was going to build an empire, some empire? All I built was a house of cards." "What are you going to do?" "What can I do? File bankruptcy, try to save something." Dean took a drink, his hands slightly unsteady. "But there's not going to be anything left, Carl. 20 years of work, Dad's land, the North 80 he left me, it's all going to auction." Dean looked up at his brother, and Carl saw something there he had never seen before. Not anger, not arrogance, fear, real fear. "Carl, I need to ask you something, and I know I don't have any right to ask. After everything I said, all those years of telling you that you were doing it wrong, that Dad was wrong, that the old way was stupid." "Just ask Dean." "The North 80, Dad's original land, our land." Dean's voice cracked. "I can't stand the thought of it going to strangers, some corporation from Chicago that doesn't care what it means. It's been Hoffman land for 50 years. If I lose it to the bank, that's bad enough. But if I lose it to strangers," he stopped. "Do you have any savings, anything you could use to buy it at auction? Keep it in the family." Carl thought about the savings he had built over 15 years of careful living. Modest harvests kept in full. No debt, no payments, no wasted money on equipment he didn't need or land he couldn't afford. It wasn't a fortune, but it was something. "How much do you think it'll go for, the land alone?" "Maybe $400 an acre the way things are now. That's $32,000 for the 80. Carl nodded slowly. "I might be able to do that." Dean's face crumpled. For a moment he looked like he had at their father's funeral, lost, scared, unable to believe what was happening to him. "You do that after everything I said?" "You're my brother, Dean. I laughed at you for 13 years. I told you that you were a fool, that Dad was a fool, that the farmall was a museum piece. I know. And you'd still help me." Carl leaned forward. "Do you remember what Dad told me that day at the hospital, the private conversation you were so angry about?" "What?" "He told me about Grandpa Heinrich, about great-uncle August, about how August bought Heinrich's farm at auction in 1933 and the family never spoke again. Dad spent 15 years saving to buy that land back, 15 years of being a tenant on land that should have been his. And you know what he said to me at the end?" Carl paused. "He said, 'Don't let what happened to us happen to your brother. When the hard times come, and they always come, family has to stick together.'" Carl stood up. "I'll be at the auction, Dean. I'll buy the North 80. And when this is over, when you're back on your feet, we'll figure out a way to put the farm back together the way Dad would have wanted." Dean couldn't speak. He sat there with tears running down his face as his younger brother walked out the door. "Let me tell you about the auction, because this is where the story reaches its turning point." The foreclosure sale was held on a Saturday morning in June, one of dozens of similar auctions that summer. The weekly ritual of watching families lose everything. The yard was crowded, speculators, corporations looking to expand their holdings, neighbors hopping for distressed equipment prices. Most came just to watch. Dean stood at the edge of the crowd watching strangers paw through his equipment, his tools, his life. Carl stood with him. "You don't have to watch this," Carl said. "Yeah, I do." Dean's voice was hollow. "I need to see it. I need to remember what happens when you think you're smarter than everyone else." The equipment went first. The John Deere 4020, 13 years old now, worn but still valuable, sold for $4,200, a fraction of what Dean had paid. The combine, the trucks, the implements, all of it gone within 2 hours. Then came the land. "All right, folks," the auctioneer called. "We're moving on to the real estate. First parcel is 80 acres in Section 12, the northern parcel of the original Hoffman Farm, prime farmland, black soil, currently in corn. Let's start the bidding at $300 an acre." A speculator from Chicago raised his paddle. $300. $350, someone else. $400, the speculator again. Carl raised his hand. $450. Heads turned. The crowd knew Carl, knew he was the brother who had kept his father's ways, never expanded, still farming 80 acres with a 30-year-old farmall. What was he doing bidding on land? The speculator consulted with his partners briefly. $500. Carl's heart was hammering. $500 an acre was $40,000 more than he had. His entire savings was $38,000, built carefully over 15 years of living below his means. He looked at Dean. Dean's face was gray, hopeless. Carl thought about his father, about Heinrich losing his land to his own brother, about Walter spending 15 years as a tenant to reclaim what should never have been lost, about the promise made in a hospital room to a dying man. $550, Carl said. The speculator frowned. $44,000 for 80 acres of farmland in the middle of a farm crisis. Not a steal, there were plenty of other farms going under. Going once at $550, the auctioneer said, going twice. Carl held his breath. Sold 80 acres at $550 per acre, total $44,000. Carl's knees went weak. He didn't have $44,000, he had $38,000. Then a hand landed on his shoulder. "I've got the other 6, a voice said. Carl turned. Harold Bennett, the farmer who owned the land south of his, 60 years old and weathered by decades of Illinois sun. "Carl, I can't." "You can pay me back when you can." Harold's voice was gruff, but his eyes were direct. "Your daddy helped me out in '68 when the floods took half my corn, never asked for anything but a handshake. I figure this makes us even." Carl shook his hand. Behind them, Dean was weeping. By noon it was over. Dean Hoffman had lost everything, everything except the North 80, the original land, the Hoffman land. His brother had saved it. Let me tell you about what happened after, because the story doesn't end at an auction. Dean Hoffman was 43 years old, bankrupt and homeless. No land, no equipment, no money, no prospects. The life he had built, the empire he had bragged about for 13 years was gone. Carl took him in. The farmhouse on Carl's 80 acres was small. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, barely enough room for 1 man. With Dean there, it was cramped and awkward and full of the particular tension that only exists between brothers who have said too many harsh things over too many years. The first few months were hard. Dean was depressed, drinking more than he should, unable to see a way forward. He had spent his entire adult life building something. Now there was nothing to build. But slowly something changed. Carl put Dean to work, not as a hired hand that would have destroyed what little was left of Dean's dignity. As a partner, equal shares, equal labor, equal say. The North 80 that Carl had bought at auction was now farmed alongside the South 80, and Dean's knowledge was genuinely valuable. He had made catastrophic mistakes, but he wasn't stupid. He knew how to work hard, how to manage a planting schedule, how to maintain equipment, how to negotiate with buyers. He had just never learned, or had forgotten, how to do any of it without debt. Carl taught him. They worked the combined 160 acres together using the 1952 Farmall Super M that Dean had once called a museum piece. It was 33 years old, older than Dean himself, but it still ran, still pulled the plow, still powered the equipment, still did everything a tractor was required to do every single day without complaint. One evening in the fall of 1986, after a long day of harvest, Dean and Carl sat on the porch drinking beer and watching the sunset over the fields. "I was wrong," Dean said. Carl waited. "About everything, about Dad, about the farmall, about you, about all of it." Dean took a long drink. "I thought I was smarter than everyone. I thought the old ways were stupid and the new ways were better. I thought debt was just a tool like a plow or a tractor, something you used to get what you wanted." He was quiet for a moment. "Debt looks like freedom, more land, more equipment, more possibilities, but it's not freedom, it's a chain. and the longer you wear it, the heavier it gets. Dad tried to tell me, you tried to tell me, I wouldn't listen. You're listening now. I didn't have a choice, Dean laughed, rueful but real. When you lose everything, you start to wonder if maybe you had it wrong all along. They sat in silence for a while, watching the light fade over the fields. The same fields their father had worked. The same fields their grandfather had lost and their father had spent 15 years reclaiming. Carl. Yeah. Thank you for saving the land, for taking me in, for, Dean's voice caught, for not giving up on me. Carl reached over and put a hand on his brother's shoulder. You're my brother, he said, that's what brothers do. Dean never rebuilt his empire, he never wanted to. The hunger that had driven him, the need to be bigger, better, more successful than everyone around him, had burned out in the fire of bankruptcy and left something quieter in its place. Something that felt, surprisingly, like peace. He and Carl worked the 160 acres together for the next 20 years. They never expanded beyond what they could pay for in cash. They never borrowed. They never forgot what Dean had learned too late and Carl had learned from their father in a hospital room. In 1992, they made it official. Carl sold Dean half the North 80, the land he had bought at auction, for exactly what he had paid for it. No interest, no profit, just a fair exchange that put the family farm back together the way it was always meant to be. The deed was registered at the county courthouse on a Tuesday afternoon in April, almost exactly 20 years after Walter Hoffman had died. You know what this means, Dean said, holding his copy of the new deed. What? We're partners now, real partners, equal shares in the whole 160. We've been partners for years, Dean. I mean legally, officially. Dean looked at the deed, then at his brother. Dad would be proud. Carl smiled. Dad would say we should stop talking and get back to work. Dean laughed, a real laugh, the first Carl had heard from him in years. You're right, he would, let's go. They walked out of the courthouse together. Let me end this story where it began. The 1952 Farmall Super M is still on the farm, over 70 years old now, one of the oldest working tractors in the county. Carl maintained it for decades. After Carl passed away in 2019, Dean took over its care. He is 82 years old and he still fires up that old Farmall every spring just to hear it run, just to remember. The John Deere 4020 that Dean bought in 1973, the one that was going to change everything, was sold at the foreclosure auction in 1985. It passed through several owners, was eventually parted out, and no longer exists as a complete machine. Dean's children and grandchildren farm the 160 acres now. They use modern equipment, a 2018 John Deere actually bought with cash from 3 years of savings, but they also keep the Farmall in the barn maintained and ready, not as decoration, as a reminder of where they came from and what it cost to learn the lesson their grandfather tried to teach. Every Thanksgiving, the whole family gathers at the farmhouse, the same farmhouse where Walter Hoffman lived, where Carl took in his bankrupt brother, where two men learned to be family again. Before dinner, Dean tells the story. He tells them about their grandfather who survived the Depression by never borrowing money. He tells them about his own pride, his own ambition, his own catastrophic mistakes. He tells them about Carl, who kept a promise to their dying father and saved the family land when Dean could not save himself. And then he tells them the lesson. The banks don't care about your dreams, Dean says. They don't care about your family or your history or how hard you worked. They care about their money. And if you owe them money, they own you. Doesn't matter how much land you have, how much equipment, how successful you look on the outside. If you're in debt, you are one bad year away from losing everything. He pauses, looking around at the faces of his family. Your great-grandfather knew that, your grandfather knew that, Uncle Carl knew that. It took me losing everything to learn it. He picks up his glass. To Carl, to Dad, to everyone who knew the truth and tried to teach it to those of us too stubborn to listen. The family drinks. And somewhere out in the barn, the 1952 Farmall Super M sits waiting. 70 years old, still ready to work. Dean once called it a museum piece. He was wrong about that too. It's not a museum piece, it's a monument to patience, to wisdom, to the quiet strength of people who understand that what you own without debt is worth more than what you have borrowed to your breaking point. To two brothers who took different roads and found their way back to each other. To a family that survived when so many around them did not. The men who survive aren't the ones with the most. They're the ones who know what enough means.